What does normal look like? To answer this question, you're going to come with me to medieval London, and we're going to meet someone who has haunted me ever since I began to study medieval literature. His name is Thomas Hoccleve, and here is a picture of him here. In many ways, Hoccleve lived an incredibly ordinary life. He was a civil servant, an officer of the Privy Seal in the Court of Westminster, working under Henry IV and then Henry V. During the day, he copied out letters and petitions. He was a bureaucrat, a scribe. But at night, Hoccleve would go home to his room and write poetry. Some of his poetry was political, but most of it was very, very personal, confessional, intimate. It's some of the earliest autobiographical writing of the self in English. In his poetry, he describes his working life in London. He goes to the office in Westminster, then he goes home, but then he goes to the pub. He spends too long in the pub. He eats too much, he drinks too much, he flirts with the girls. When they kiss him in the tavern, this is fantastic, but there's something that stops him taking it any further. He's a little impotent, we suspect. He also describes getting a boat across the Thames, and the boatman flatters him and calls him Master Hoccleve. Hoccleve is so impressed by this that he overtips the boatman, and then he goes home and he feels very ashamed of himself. It's a very ordinary working life in the city, a life that many of us can identify with, the daily grind, our own personal insecurities and imbalances. But then in 1414, Hoccleve has what we would now call a nervous breakdown. He has a period of mental illness, he can't work. He describes it as a wild infirmity in which his brain goes off to play for a certain space. Obviously very distressing. But the hardest thing for Hoccleve is when he goes back to work after recovering and no one believes that he is well again. People still think he is sick. People still turn away from him when they meet him in the street. So I'm going to read to you some of Hoccleve's poetry when he describes these things that happen. This is, the picture here is one of the manuscripts of Hoccleve's work. It's not a particularly beautiful medieval manuscript. It's an ordinary medieval manuscript. But here's what Hoccleve says about himself. For oft when he in Westminster Hall and eke in London among the press went, he said a chair, a button and a pall of him that were in want me for to call to companier. Here had they cast a ree when he had met her, as they not me say. Often I would be in Westminster Hall or London amongst the crowd, and I saw the faces grow dejected and pale of the people who used to call me to come to play with them, to company. They would turn their heads away when I met them, as if they couldn't see me. He becomes very dejected, very depressed, and describes the dreadful grind of going to work back and forth along the streets of London. And then one day, as that he honors from Westminster come, vexed full grievously with thoughtful hate, thus thought he, a great fool I am, this parliament a days thus to bet, and in and out labour fast and sweat, wandering and heaviness to purchase, sithen he stond out of all favour and grace. One day I was coming from Westminster. I was sorrowfully troubled with this miserable sickness. And I thought, I am such a fool to be pounding the pavements in and out, working, going backwards and forwards. All I'm getting is anxiety and depression. No one is going to look on me with any favour or grace. It's a very devastating portrait of mental illness in London. And in fact, Hoccleve is so depressed that he thinks perhaps it is time to creep into his grave and die. Let's get some historical context here. Hoccleve is writing in the early 15th century, so we're halfway along the 100 Years' War between England and France. It's 200 years before the death of Shakespeare. It's 15 years before the death of Joan of Arc. It's several decades before Gutenberg prints the first Bible, and several decades before the birth of Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. It's also just 7 years after the founding of the Bethlehem Hospital for the Insane in London that would later become known as Bedlam. So we're just starting to see the pathologisation and medicalisation of insanity. What do medieval people think about the insanity? Well, it could be a form of divine punishment from God, or it could be a form of demonic possession by the devil. That would be the most scary thing. Or it could be an imbalance of the four humours that were thought to hold body and mind together. But it could also be the result of severe emotional trauma, a loss of reason through madness. Let me give you two very famous examples from medieval literature. The famous knight Sir Lancelot has been tricked into sleeping with the Lady Elaine, thinking that she is his mistress, Queen Guinevere. But when the Queen finds out that Lancelot has been unfaithful to her, he leaps naked out of a bay window, you love that detail, a bay window, and gets covered with thorns as he falls into a bush. And this is what Sir Thomas Malory writes about Lancelot, who then goes mad. Sir Lancelot suffered and endured many sharp showers that ever ran wild wood from place to place, and lived by fruit and such as he might get, and drank water 2 years, and other clothing had he but little but his shirt and breeches. And similarly, the knight Yvain in Chrétien de Troyes' French romance similarly has gone off to fight in the tournaments for a year, and he tells his wife he'll be back in a year, but he stays away having too much fun fighting in tournaments, and his wife doesn't want him back. He is similarly devastated. This is the modern translation. Then such a great tempest arose in his mind that he went mad. He ripped and tore at his clothing and fled across fields and plains. He stalked wild animals in the forest and killed them and ate their raw flesh. These knights then have, through emotional distress, become incredibly uncivilized. They've lost all the courtly trappings of armor, clothing, food, wine, cooked meat. They're living like wild men, almost like animals. This is the result of severe emotional trauma. But Hoccleve is not a romantic, chivalric knight driven by grand passions. He is, quite frankly, much more like one of us. So what upsets Hoccleve most when he's recovering from his madness is the sense that his co-workers and his friends will not look him in the eye, will not believe that he is better. In fact, what they do is gossip about him behind his back. So they say that Hoccleve, when he was in his madness, would behave a little bit like a wild animal himself, like an ox or a deer. He would cast his head around too wildly, or hold his head up too high, or he would be always fidgeting and twitching and moving his feet around too much. He wasn't reliable. So what Hoccleve does is he goes home at night and practices looking in his mirror to see what normal looks like. And these are the stanzas that I'm going to read now. I'm sorry, here is a picture of Yvain naked, wandering through the wilderness. So here is Hoccleve. And in my chamber at home one that he was myself alone, in this wise rocht, I straight unto my mirror and my glass, to look who that may of my chair thought, to look if any other were it than it ought. For fain would he, if it had not been writ, amended it to my cunning and micht. And so when I was in my bedroom at home, this is what I would do. I went straight to my mirror and I would look to see what my expression looked like, to see if it was anything other than it should be, because I would have gladly changed it and improved it if I could. The second stanza. Many a socht madi to this mirror, thinking, if they look in this manner among folk as they now do, no error of suspect look may in me face appear. This countenance, I am sure, and this chair, if he forth use, is nothing reprovable to him that han concetus raisonnable. Many a leap in front of my mirror I made, thinking, if I look amongst company in this way, or that way, or with this expression, maybe they will look normal to people who have got reasonable understanding. A very powerful moment of the intimate medieval self, really thinking about the relationship between private and public in that way. I think it's very easy to identify with Hoccleve in his story of sickness and recovery. I think many of us, whether we've had serious illness or anxiety or depression, have had those feelings of pounding the streets on the way to work, wondering, what is this all for? This is pointless. And then to have that added insecurity of thinking that people are looking at you oddly, very, very devastating, very easy to identify with Hoccleve and that social insecurity. But one of the saddest things about this poem is what happens next. Hoccleve's friend knocks on the door, and Hoccleve says, "Friend, I've written this fantastic poem about my mental illness, trying to explain to everybody that I am well again. I'm going to read it to you, tell me what you think." He reads the poem to his friend, and Hoccleve says, "I want to get copies made. I want people to read this, to know. I want to explain to them how well I am." But the friend says, "Nee, Thomas, wara, do not so. No, Thomas, be careful. Don't do that." The friend is embarrassed by mental illness. The friend doesn't want to know. The friend wants to protect Hoccleve from this further disclosure of the self. But Hoccleve did not listen to the friend. He kept that manuscript, and we're now able to read this astonishing document 600 years later. I sometimes think Hoccleve would have felt very comfortable in the world of Facebook and Instagram. He was a compulsive sharer, and anyone who's had a form of mental illness or recovery often wants to tell that story. We want to make that connection. We want people to know how we felt. And this is true even across those 600 years that separate us from Hoccleve. So when I think about Hoccleve and I think about our work on the study of emotions, it reminds me that historical study isn't just about historical fact. It is about that emotional connection across time and across culture, across gender, across race, that is what holds us all together. And this is the really important part of intellectual work. So sometimes when I think about Hoccleve, I put my medieval scholarly hat on and I think about the changing nature of historical subjectivity. But other times, as in 2 days ago, when I was rehearsing in front of my mirror, trying to see what I looked like, being Thomas Hoccleve, seeing what he looked like in front of his mirror, I did feel a very, very strong connection. Plus all the natural anxieties about appearing in front of you. Do I look right? What does a TEDx speaker look like? Do I look normal? Very, very scary thought. But this is what really holds my work with medieval literature together, is this powerful emotional connection with Hoccleve's burning desire to make sense of himself. It is a desire that I think we can still honour today. Thank you very much.